Greetings, Diocese of Oregon. My name is Alan Murray, and I'm a co-chair of the Deputation to the 80th General Convention. We are delighted to provide a brief summary and highlights of the issues that were discussed at the 80th General Convention. Here is a list of our deputation. The deputation spent many months preparing for the 80th General Convention. This includes attending regular deputation meetings organized by General Convention Office and the respective legislative committee meetings as assigned. The General Convention, which occurs every 3 years, was initially planned for July of 2021. No one would have predicted a global COVID pandemic that brought our common lives to a screeching halt. We as a church are called to reimagine how to continue our common worship and our governance. As such, the convention was postponed to July of 2022 to mitigate the risk of COVID. In spring of 2022, with the arrival of Omicron, the General Convention Office was advised to shorten the convention and limit the number of attendees. The convention was shortened to 4 legislative days. Attendance was limited to active bishops, deputies, 1 alternate in each order. Worship was held separately in each house. Proof of vaccination and booster were required. Medical, surgical mask or KN95 masks were required during the convention and in common spaces. Daily rapid test was also required before arriving upon registration and daily thereafter. Deputies elected Julia Ayala Harris to succeed President Gay Jennings as House of Deputies President. President Ayala Harris is the youngest and first woman of color to lead the House of Deputies. The Reverend Rachel Table Hamilton was elected to serve as the Vice President of the House of Deputies. She is the first Indigenous person and first ordained woman to serve as Vice President. For the first time in the history of our church, all the presiding officers were persons of color. Also, our own Reverend Brandon Barnacle from St. Francis Wilsonville was elected to the Board of Directors of the Church Pension Group. Because of the abbreviated schedule, legislative committee work, rather than taking place at the convention itself, was carried out online in a public via live stream in the months leading up to physical gatherings in early July. All legislative committee works concluded on June 25th. A total of 431 resolutions were submitted and 414 were acted upon. The remaining 17 resolutions were deferred to the 81st General Convention. Here are some of the highlights of the resolutions. Racial reconciliation was one of the priorities. The presiding officer's working group on truth-telling, reckoning, and healing proposed several resolutions to the 80th General Convention for considerations. The working group began with the premise that the Episcopal Church has spent decades passing resolutions and developing programs to address the historic racism that infects our structures and systems, and that the people most oppressed by our collective failure to act in meaningful ways are uninterested in another effort that has no urgency, no requirements, and no consequences. A125 is a historic resolution that establishes the Episcopal Coalition for Racial Equity and Justice. It also specifies a draw of 10% of our endowment and trust of the Episcopal Church to fund these efforts. A127 is a resolution for truth-telling in examining our Episcopal Church history with Indigenous boarding schools. A budget of $2 million was set aside for this work. Calls for A1226 calls for a review and correction of the prayer book for any colonial, white supremacy, and racist language. A129 calls for the forensic audit to better understand the historic origins of church assets. A130 calls for the development of best practices in hiring and developing organizational cultural competencies. A131 urges all Episcopalians to utilize the phrase people of color when referring to individuals in communities marginalized by racism and white supremacy instead of the word use of BIPOC. C009 institute anti-racism training in the House of Deputies Rule of Orders for all deputies. And finally, D019 call for the 80th General Convention to promote the land acknowledgement within the Episcopal Church and its affiliate organizations. In the next 2 years, dioceses are encouraged to start working with local indigenous people to develop land acknowledgement. A006, regarding prayer book and liturgy, authorized lesser fees and fasts, and the Book of Vocational Services from 2018. A059 is a first reading of the amendment to our Constitution, Article 10, that addresses changes to how and what liturgies are authorized by General Convention. This means liturgies such as marriage rites for same-gender couple can be given the same prayer book status without the full revision of the prayer book. And there are many other resolutions regarding the prayer book and liturgy, including the Juneteenth resolution asking for SCLM to develop emancipation liturgy that are not all US focused. There is also a resolution, among many others, calling for Bishop Barbara Harris to be placed in lesser fees and fasts. C030 requests for establishment of task force to address the anti-Semitic and anti-Jewish impact of lectionary reading, especially during the Holy Week. Here are some of the resolutions on creation care. A087 calls for the Episcopal Church to commit to a goal on net carbon neutrality by 2030. There are some other resolutions regarding these areas, including commit to pressing the work of addressing global climate change and environmental justice, carbon-intensive lending, encouraging utilization of virtual governance option for creation care, encourage Green Deal legislation, and creates an internal carbon offset programs. Regarding the life of the church, D050 is a resolution that provided a merger of the Diocese of North Texas into the Diocese of Texas. D055 added Cuba to Province 2, and C021 moved Puerto Rico to Province 2. This is another reminder why we should not use the term national church to describe the Episcopal Church. The Episcopal Church is an international church, which includes convocation of European churches, Taiwan, Micronesia in Province 8, and many other foreign dioceses in Province 9, which consists of Latin America. A156 is the State of Church resolution that creates a task force to re-envision the definition of membership in the church. In the area of church governance, here are some of the highlights. A048 made changes to the budget by streamlining the process. A228 establishes a 100 million biennium budget. A138 allowed for legislative committee meetings to occur before General Convention. And finally, A001 established criteria for General Convention site selection to consider the political conditions that pose threats to the physical safety and well-being. This is in response to the states that has anti-gay and trans legislation and states that ban abortion that may pose a healthcare threat to those who may need emergency reproductive healthcare services. Social justice rooted in our baptismal covenant continues to be front and center in the Episcopal Church. A063 established a position for the Director of LGBTQ and Women's Ministry. A003 urges all dioceses to adopt a uniform paid family leave policy. D083 affirms all Episcopalians should be able to access abortion services and birth control with no restriction. D00367 call for more prevention and intervention against gun violence. and B008 calls for the cessation of conflict in Ukraine and condemned the aggression launched by the Russian Federation. There are many other social justice resolutions. The Legislative Committee on Social Justice and United States Policy reviewed 28 resolutions. Here are some of the resolutions that were adopted. These resolutions authorize the Episcopal Public Policy Network to engage in nonpartisan advocacy at the federal level regarding these social justice issues. The 80th General Convention in D029 affirms non-binary access and leadership, and D093 is a resolution calling for broad representation and discernment processes. These resolution acknowledges the hurt, pain, and unequal treatment of any historically marginalized peoples in the Episcopal Church. In the area of stewardship and socially responsible investing, A072 commends the Episcopal examples of responsible investing, and the Diocese of Oregon is one of the 15 Episcopal institutions recognized for our work in SRI. There are many other resolutions regarding these areas, including calling for divestment and just transition, to ask us to continue to explore moral and ethical benefits of divesting from fossil fuels, reinvesting in renewable energy, to study the environmental impact and guidance in investing in cryptocurrencies, and calling the Church to address the burden of medical debt by directing the Church to consider purchasing medical debt of local communities through the use of a surplus and our monies allocated for outreach. Sexual harassment, sexual exploitation, and safeguarding propose several resolutions. In the areas in Resolution A061, it amends the Canon 1.4.6J to include data including gender. Some other resolutions call for the diocese to create a plan to narrow gender gaps, to authorize support interim use of local adaptation of model anti-harassment policy, to participate in Thursday in Black, which is to encourage wearing Black on Thursday to increase awareness of the need to act against sexual violence in all forms. And C064 is this resolution calling for Breaking the Silent Sunday to be celebrated on Sunday closest to November 25th, which is International Day for Elimination of Violence Against Women. All resolutions can be found on vbinder.net. Finally, our very own Deputy Becky Snow was being honored in the House of Deputies for her years of service as deputy since 1976. In her own words, that has meant that I was part of a decision to interpret the canons to allow women to be ordained, to approve the new prayer book, to recognize the LGBTQ folks are beloved children of God with equal place in the church, and many other momentous changes over the past 46 years. Here are all the women bishops in the 80th General Convention and the very first LGBTQ caucus at the General Convention.
Ancient wisdom here. Because when Christ is the center, when we say yes to the way of unselfish, sacrificial love, then we do the work of racial reconciliation and justice. Then we're able to do the work of truth-telling and reckoning and healing. And then we can help our church and help our land be a land where there's plenty good room for all of God's children. So remember where you came from. your baptism. Remember this, Jesus. Remember and be remembered as God's new creation, God's beloved, God's precious child of God. And remember, as the late Bishop Barbara Harris told us over and over again, the God behind you is greater than any problem ahead of you.
And finally, my co-chair Wes Sadachek and I wish to express our profound gratitude to this great crew. What a great honor and privilege to serve with you all. Thank you for your flexibility and adaptability in adjusting to the constant changes of this historic General Convention. We also want to thank Bishop Akiyama for her collaboration and all the diocesan staff for providing all the logistical supports. And thank you, Diocese of Oregon, for electing us and most importantly, praying for us. This concludes our report. Thank you.